Hello, friends. There we go with the lights. I'm Mark Skorka, president of OPERA America, and I want to first congratulate those who have made it here tonight through rain and through absolute presidential gridlock here in Manhattan. I'm told that it's really impossible to get around outside, but thanks for making it. And I just want to welcome as well all of the people who are watching this on our live stream. Welcome to the National Opera Center here on a rainy night in New York. This evening, our onstage program is dedicated to the other half of opera, because opera is words and music. And we hear lots of music here at the Opera Center, but we don't often talk about the words. And of course, the words are the essential partner in giving rise to a musical theatrical art form that is equally theatrical as it is musical. So we're going to focus on that tonight. And I just wanted to say a special thanks to Judy Wolf, who's a board member at Arizona Opera and is herself a librettist. And she's made a special gift in support of this program tonight, and we want to thank Judy. We have with us two very important, prolific librettists, and we're going to welcome them to the stage in just a minute. The first is Stephanie Fleischmann. She is an author, librettist, and playwright. She has done operas for Houston Grand Opera, Santa Fe Opera, West Edge Opera, and American Lyric Theater. She's worked with And that's just the beginning of the list. And I always hesitate to make a list because I can't read everybody. She's worked with composers, among others, Christopher Cerrone, Justine Chen, Anna Klein, Jeremy Howard Beck, and David Hanlon. So a lot of varied experience with companies of different sizes and with composers of different styles. Deborah Brevoort is here, a librettist and a playwright. She's worked with composers Michael Ching, Patrick Saluri, Deirdre Murray, and others, doing operas for Cincinnati Opera and Glimmerglass, Virginia Opera, Opera Colorado, American Lyric Theater, On-Site Opera, and a number of others. She currently is the librettist mentor for the Washington National Opera American Opera Initiative. So she is not only creating work, but she's helping to nurture the careers of librettists who will enliven our stages years from now. Both of them are winners of the Mark Campbell Opera Librettist Prize. It is a prize that is funded by librettist Mark Campbell, which is awarded through Opera America, to recognize those career artists who've really made an indelible impression on opera through the creation of a libretto. So it is really a great pleasure that both of our guests tonight have been honored with that prize. This evening, the discussion will be moderated by our Director of Artistic Operations, Noelle Deutsch. So without further ado, please welcome our guests and Noelle, and enjoy the evening. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone, to joining us both here in person and on our live stream. We're so happy to have you with us. And my sincere thanks to Deborah and Stephanie for joining us tonight. I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to speak a little bit with you both. First and foremost, I want to start with a two-part question that we often ask our guests here in the conversation series. Who brought you to your first opera? And what was the first opera you attended that really drew you into the art form? Deborah, I'll start with you.
Oh, okay. Well, when I was a kid, my parents performed in an amateur Gilbert and Sullivan opera company. So I was raised in a G&S troupe. And, but I don't know that you can really call that opera. I came to it very late. My first opera that I saw was when I was 38 years old. And I was in graduate school for musical theater at NYU, and we were given an assignment to write a finale that was based upon the Marriage of Figaro finale. And we were given the libretto, and we were told to write it for animals. Crazy. It turned into my NYU thesis musical. But lucky for me, Marriage of Figaro was playing at the Met, and so I went and I got cheap seats, and I was up in the nosebleed section, and I went into a little, like on the side, and I brought a flashlight. This was before the days where they had the subtitles. And I had the whole booth to myself, and I sat up there with the flashlight studying the libretto. And that was my first opera at the age of 38. And what was powerful to me about it was the libretto. I thought, wow, this De Ponte is a really great playwright.
That's
and
amazing.
You can do playwriting with incredible economy. And of course, obviously the music. I mean, Figaro's music, you can't get better than that. But that was my first encounter with opera outside of my childhood experience with Gilbert and Sullivan operettas.
Wow, that's amazing. Stephanie, what about you?
I grew up around classical music, but not opera. So I grew up around in the orchestral milieu, and my very first sort of not opera that I remember seeing was when I was 5, and I lived in England, and I went, I think, to see the movie of Fiddler on the Roof with my grandmother, who had left Germany in 1935, and I just have this profound memory of just being kind of like shattered and driving in a London cab through rainy streets, seeing the world completely changed at a very young age. But the first sort of, again, not exactly opera, was the Magic Flute, Bergman's Magic Flute. So I didn't go to the opera, but I saw this amazing thing where I was just pulled into the kind of wonder of it. And I think maybe Amal and the Night Visitors was my first actual being present at the Music Center in Los Angeles at an opera.
Wow, it's interesting. You both had early experiences with classical music and then came into opera kind of as you went along. Mm-hmm. So I'll start with you this time, Stephanie. What was the first libretto that really caught your attention? Was it one of those, or was it something else?
No, I mean, I think it was probably Einstein on the Beach, which was non-narrative and very like kind of the Gertrude Steinian like landscape theater. And just that words could kind of create spaces, and that words and sound and music could kind of conjure a different kind of space-time. And then I remember also being really obsessed with the libretto for La Mort de Loin and reading it like long before I ever saw the opera.
Wow. And Deborah, you've already said that obviously the Marriage of Figaro, immediately your first opera, you were drawn in by the libretto. Was there a second one that you remember as you got more into opera, as you saw more operas? Was there a time when is it every libretto, or was there another one that you really were drawn to as you started to decide that maybe this was something you wanted to write for?
Well, see, I saw the Marriage of Figaro, and then I didn't really go to the opera. I couldn't afford it. But I was really working in the musical theater. And so my familiarity with librettos are all musical theater. I mean, I would say Sondheim, Sweeney Todd, it's an opera. Janine Tesori and Tony Kushner's Carolina Change. The power of the music, the specificity of those words, the specificity of every note telling a story, being part of a character. The craft of it, those, I think they were really formative librettos. But I didn't really then start attending the opera until I did the ALT program, and now I'm an opera goer. But I came to it very late.
That's amazing.
And I came to it through musical theater.
Yeah. I love that. It's never too late to convert our musical theater friends to opera. I'm curious to know who, in your estimation, is the best non-living opera librettist, if you have one, and what makes them good? And are these qualities broadly applicable, or is it specific? And I'll start with you, Stephanie.
Well, again, I'm kind of cheating, but I'd like to say Alice Goodman, who isn't writing opera libretti, so maybe she kind of semi-counts as a...
Yeah.
Because she is using poetry to tell stories, and the sort of rhythms of her lines and a combination of high and low, of like epic, mythic, and really quotidian vernacular, and the way she's conjuring inner states in her characters. And again, specificity is a huge thing, and the sense of words being kind of like coiled like springs, so that they have a kind of an energy, and they're waiting to be activated, and that's what you feel when you look at a text like that. And also the internal rhyme, and I love near rhyme personally, and I love how she plays with sort of line endings. So I mean, I have really studied her. I feel like I'm not an expert on Da Ponte. Like I could say Boito and Da Ponte, but I'm, you know, the dramaturgy of what I mean, Da Ponte, I think it's craft and like moving a story along and making sort of music blossom and then moving it along. But that's just me looking at these libretti and kind of seeing what I see. And they're translated, and I don't have the same kind of connection.
Sure, yeah. What about you, Deborah? Favorite non-living librettist?
I would say Stephen Sondheim. Again, to just use Sweeney Todd as an example, he really introduced me to the way in which musical motifs could really tell story. Because Sweeney Todd has a plot that without any motivic material would take about 8 hours to do on stage. And I really like plot. I like story. I'm very story based, and when you're working with musical forms, you really have to find a simple story. You can't get too plotty. You can't do.
Right.
You don't have time.
Right.
But Sweeney Todd is one of the most complicated, convoluted plots that you will find on any stage. And yet, and even so, it's 3 hours? I mean, it's a long musical, but the economy that he achieves through the use of motivic material and the way that he weaves that showed me how I can take on complicated stories, and if I understand the way that music is telling stories or creating character development through motivic material, something Janine Tesori does beautifully also. That I can then do what I like to do, which is tell stories in a form that it doesn't allow too much story. And so that's what I learned from Sondheim.
This actually leads perfectly into my next question, talking about economy and the energy behind words and specificity. But Toni Morrison said at Opera America's annual conference in 2005 that a good libretto has to leave room for music. So I'd love to hear what you think she meant by that. And I'll start with you, Deborah, because we're leading from your last answer.
Well, I understand this as a musical theater lyricist, which is that you have to underwrite. We always say you have to underwrite your lyrics, because if you don't underwrite them, again, you're going to have an 8-hour song or what. You have to leave room for the music. And so what that means, and I know this sort of bleeds into another question we're going to be talking about, the difference between playwriting and libretto writing. When you're playwriting or even writing a musical, the words are doing all the work, right? They're the engine of the work. You're doing character, you're doing story, you're doing action, you're doing everything. I mean, yes, there's visual things that are communicating, but the engine is the words. And so you're having to do it all. And you can't do it all in an opera, or again, you'd have a 10-hour long opera, right? You have to do something minimally that summons music, because music is the engine. So the other thing too is when you're a writer or a playwright, you try to make music with your words, right? And you understand this, being a poet. But if you make too much music with your words, then you get too much music and it smushes. I don't know, that's how I describe it to my students. You don't want it to smush. So you have to really strip it away so that those words can sort of catch the wind of music and fly, right? And if you have too many words, then music can't lift it off the ground. It can't reach the air. So you have to pack light for the journey and allow music to lift the words, and you don't have to lift. You don't make the music. I don't know if that makes sense.
I love that. It does, yeah. And we often talk about how collaborative opera is as an art form, just between all of the different elements. And so I love that that can be applied here. Stephanie, what do you think Toni meant when she said that the libretto has to leave room for music?
Well, I love that expression, summons music. But yeah, I mean, just the fact that if there's too much text, it just sort of makes sense. But I feel like our job is to kind of write these blueprints that move a story and through time and space, and that conjure character with like the minimal amount of information. And I'm constantly still learning how to do that and about that. So I'm definitely guilty of maybe writing a little bit too much, and then having my composer say, I just think if there's just a little less, or I only have these many lines and it must have this rhythm, then I have to choose the 2 or 3 details that have to go away. And I've learned that like having one detail can be so much more powerful than having 4. And the music is sort of activating that detail and yeah, carrying us through that together. The skeleton of the words and the music are kind of merging to create these spaces of time and place if I were doing all of that with the words, there would just be no room.
I do that too. I overwrite everything, and but I like to do that. I always tell my composer, don't worry, I'm going to cut. But these are our options. I mean, I think if you overwrite, you give your composer more options. You can't be precious and hold on to everything. But you're absolutely right about like one detail will be set to music will have more power than 4. But I think better to be an overwriter than an underwriter, because you just have to have a red pen and you have to be ruthless with it. Yeah. But if you overwrite, you have more options.
Right, start with options and then be willing to let go.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think this is helpful for those of us who do not write libretti, because I run my emails through a grammar checking software, and it's always telling me I have wordy sentences. So this will be really helpful for me, this advice going forward. But I want to talk a little bit about your processes specifically. In addition to your work as opera librettists, like we were just talking about, you're also playwrights. And so can you break down the differences in how you approach playwriting versus how you approach writing for opera? Are there dramaturgical differences in the way that you approach the work, tell the story, and shape the characters that don't have to do with the music necessarily? Stephanie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm writing a play, I don't approach it with the rigor that I approach writing a libretto, in that I may be drawn towards an image and have a question about an image and be sort of meditating on a character, and I want to put that character and that image together and see what happens. But if I did that for an opera, it would just completely backfire. I need to be writing an outline. I had never written an outline before I became an opera librettist, and we were trained at American Lyric Theater, which we are very grateful for, to write these treatments and like beat by beat, what's happening now, how are we making this transition, and using active verbs. So this training has helped me, because I'm a little dreamy, really be disciplined about what is the dramatic torque of this moment, and then I can look at the whole thing and go, oh, this is going to be a duet, and this is going to be an aria, and we can see it all, we can lay it out here, and what do you think of that? And I mean, I'm just kind of feeling my way. If you have it, to the composer, if you think this should not be a duet for musical reasons, I'm totally open to that. So I think that's the big difference. And then I have been writing more sort of fable-like lately, operas, and that opera feels like a great form to explore the fairy tale or the fable or worlds that, I mean, I've also written operas that are very gritty, naturalistic, grounded in this world, but I'm loving being able to enter into this form of the fable and the fairy tale. And with my plays, I feel like somehow they are, even if they're historical, they're grounded more in a world that might be more recognizable, and opera gives me the freedom to sort of explode images and make anything is possible, even as the rigor is really demanding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're saying it's about the balance between making intentional choices while also having a world of possibilities in front of you when you're writing for opera. Yeah, I love that. Deborah, what about you? What are the differences?
Yeah, they're so different. To pick up on what you said about outlines, I mean, I would never outline a play. An outline actually is where a lot of the creative work happens in opera. That's actually where I do my closest collaboration with the composer, because it's not like making a plan for the work, it is the work. Because you're building the musical architecture of the piece, and you're doing that in collaboration. And I remember on my first full-length opera, Steal a Pencil for Me with Gerald Cohen, I spent 4.5, 5 months in deep conversation with him every day, beat by beat, and what was happening, but how it was happening musically, right? What was that musical architecture? So much so that by the end of that outlining process, I could write a full-length libretto in 3 weeks. But so the outlining is where because a lot of what we do is architectural, right? You're creating the skeleton for the work when you're doing more than that, but
yeah.
you know, but that's a big part of it. So, whereas when I'm writing a play, I usually don't know where I'm going. And in fact, if I do know where I'm going, I'm not interested in writing the play, because the play is, I always start with something I don't know, or I start with a question that I don't understand, or I start with a situation that, you know, if it's a historical situation, I just can't figure out like what made that happen. Like I wrote a play called The Women of Lockerbie about the women of Lockerbie, Scotland, who laundered the 11,000 articles of clothing that were found in Pan Am 103. And they spent a year laundering bloody clothes. And I mean, it was just, yeah, and I thought, what? I thought, that's a beautiful story, but like, what would drive somebody to do that? And I wrote that story really struggling to understand the level of pain that they must have experienced that would motivate them to do something like that for a year, right? And not just to do something for a year, to do something really grisly and difficult and horrific for a year as a way to cope with something. So for me, that was the question of the play, you know, and how does one get over an event like that? And every play for me starts with that question, which means I don't know where I'm going, which means I can't outline it, which means I'm generating mountains of pages that are going into the garbage can because I'm struggling to bring that world and really illuminate the human heart that's at the heart of it. So it's a process of discovery in a different kind of way. And of course, then the words are doing everything, right? You're the engine. You're driving the bus. As a playwright, as a librettist, you're not driving the bus.
So I want to ask you both to kind of piggyback off of that. Is it totally dependent on the project, or does one process take longer than the other? So do you find that because you've outlined a libretto, because you're collaborating in opera, that it's a faster process to write a libretto than it would be for a play, or is it completely dependent on the project itself, the length of the piece, or the questions that you're asking?
Well, we librettists are forced to turn around librettos in very short times, and I would like to put a word out about that.
So this is a PSA.
PSA to the listening audience. It's not possible to write a libretto in 3 weeks, so please. But this happens all the time. We're given very little time. So it happens faster because we are forced to make it happen faster, which is why we're both very experienced playwrights. So we're at a point where maybe we can work faster than we could if we were younger.
Sure.
But a play, by its very nature, as a sort of an instrument of discovery, you want to give yourself the time to sort of bushwhack through that subject until it becomes clear. And a play, I've written a play in 4 months. It took me 5 years to write The Women of Lockerbie. They're all different. So plays tend to be longer because of that, but we could use a little more time with our librettos.
Okay, that's our official PSA. Stephanie, have you had a similar experience with?
Yeah, definitely the truncated writing time, but I do find that when you have that really rock solid, or hopefully rock solid outline, writing it is not as time consuming as this other process. Like, I can go, oh, tomorrow I'm going to write scene 3, or I'll give myself 3 days for scene 3, and because I know where I'm going, I can explore in scene 3. I can push words around and dream into scene 3, but I basically know what I need to do for scene 3, and so it's actually something I wouldn't mind trying to do as a playwright, but I haven't yet done. So, but I will say that the actual writing of the libretto may be fairly swift, but that the actual process of making an opera is not. And the work that is asked of the librettist, or at least I like to sort of participate in and give of myself, is that back and forth with the composer, and revising as the composer is writing, and trying, and actually going back to the drawing board. I mean, I have one particular collaborator who I've written 2 operas with, Jeremy Howard Beck, and our second opera, he probably, even though everybody was very happy with the libretto and we'd had a great reading and everything, when he was composing, he must have asked me to rewrite the libretto about 40 times, and I did. And so it expands to fill the space, and then, you know, there's so many phases of writing an opera, and the librettist is called upon on all those phases. So it does take time, but we can be doing other things while those other phases are going on as well.
Right. And so this kind of leads into my next question about your composer relationship. Do you write libretti differently for composers who write very different music?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, every relationship is different. I mean, I try to listen to their music and think about what their music is just on my own. They want very different things. They may be incredibly architectural and all about rhythm, or they may be crazy expansive and explosive and just need something very simple to allow for all of that great explosiveness to happen. I've worked with composers who have written music and then I've written text to their music, so that's the opposite way. David Hanlon is very theatrically oriented, so we're in a way we're always having a truly theatrical conversation every dramatic beat. So it just is, it's always shifting.
Deborah, what about you? Do you approach the libretto differently when you're working with different composers who write different music?
No.
I love that you have different answers.
But I don't have an approach for libretto. The libretto is going to will come from the story or from the thing that we're trying to write, and it will be what that subject needs. And the libretto will be created in collaboration through outlining and lots of discussion with the composer, so that we're writing the same piece. That's really important, because if that collaboration doesn't happen early on and you're not writing the same piece, you're in really big trouble. And so it's through that collaboration and what I understand and what the composer brings to it and what that story requires, I then write the libretto. And obviously, once the composer starts working, and some composers will go away and you won't hear from them for a year. I mean, and some will leave messages on my favorite being, hi, you know that line in scene 2, I need 7 syllables and the last one has to be A. It's like, so you rewrite, to that. So that's because I don't have a way that I write libretto. The story determines what that's going to be, and sometimes it's going to be very story based, and sometimes it's not going to be. It depends on what it is, and it and the musical structure and architecture that we've created through the outline will be in consultation with the composer, so there's no surprises when the composer gets the libretto. It's what we're all agreed upon, right?
Of course. And I want to keep talking about the composer-librettist relationship. I want to know, to you, what are some of the most important factors in a good collaboration between a composer and a librettist? And aside from Wagner writing his own libretti, lots of the personal relationships between great composers and librettists have been tense. And do you have to get along to be able to create great opera? What do you think?
No, you don't. But it really helps if you do. Every once in a while you have one of those collaborations, right? And you don't have to be best friends with your composer. But the important thing is you're writing the same piece. And it's very easy to, through a lack of communication or a lack of communication or a lack of respect, to sort of do your own thing and find out that you're really not writing the same piece. And that has only happened to me once. And I really never want to repeat that experience again. But actually, I get along with my composers. I like my composers.
We love to hear that.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're my favorite people, yeah.
Stephanie, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it can be challenging, but I feel like if you're going to endeavor to write this thing that's going to take you 3 years together, you're going to spend at least 3 years of your lives together, you're going to get pretty close. And as long as you are able to keep those lines of communication open and you are able to listen, and that listening for both of you is really the most important thing. Also, the respect. Also, I've found that confidence, like on both parts, like if someone is really confident in what they do, you can totally disagree and have great conversations about it because they're not threatened if you're not agreeing. And something really amazing can come out of that, seeing it differently. But as long as you are willing to talk to get to that place where you've solved something so it works for you both. I mean, I feel like I have lots of an expanded family because of all these composers. And it's not always easy, but like the willingness to keep going back to the drawing board together and keep knocking our heads against the wall together to figure out like what's not working and what if we just, had one syllable less or changed, that chord, the thing that we both agree we want to say would be communicated with that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to ask you a little bit about the future of opera and your personal contributions to the field and maybe what you hope to contribute to the field. As the creators of the future of American opera, what would you like to see happen in the next 5 years to move the art form forward? Stephanie, I'll start with you.
I think one thing that would be so helpful would be a kind of some way, and it's an institutional systemic problem, but of having opera and theater speak more to each other so that directors of theater could maybe get some kind of training quickly so that if some famous theater director is hired to direct at the Met, for instance, and it's a flop because they haven't had some kind of immersion into opera, or because there's so many incredible directors in theater who should be doing opera, for instance. And then the other thing is the model of theater, which can't happen in opera economically, of having longer runs, I think would be just liberating. And we would learn so much about the art that we're making for it to play to larger audiences and to be able to kind of visit it over the course of a longer run. So figuring out how they can speak to each other is one thing. I mean, there's so many things. I mean, expanding the kinds of stories that we're telling and the ways that we're telling them. And also, because we are in a moment of, where we're really thinking about which stories we're telling and who is telling those stories, and a lot of it, the conversation becomes identity-based. I just would like to say that I think that because we are makers, the freedom to keep open, the freedom to write any story, because that's what we do. We go inside of someone that we've never met and conjure them their thoughts. So an openness to that, I think, is something that I'm hopeful for.
Yeah. Do you feel like new work lends itself better to the longer run model that theater has?
The chamber-sized work, maybe, but chamber-sized work is kind of I'm encountering is kind of an interesting issue, because it's economically not viable for some opera companies, and so there are limitations there too. Yeah.
But I'm really encouraged that, the Met made the announcement that they're going to be doing more new work in their season, because why? The new work is selling, right? And certainly, look, opera and theater are in big trouble right now post-COVID with loss of funding and loss of audiences, but opera's doing better than theater, actually. And I think it's because there's a lot of new work. And so what I want to see is more of that. I'm really interested in, I travel a lot internationally, and I work internationally in the theater, not in the opera. And I'm really interested in sort of bringing things that I've encountered or learned overseas in different cultures into the opera, and I would like to see more stories that are really more global and that come from different cultures. I always like to joke that I would like to see no more operas where the soprano dies, and that's a trope that is pretty tired, I think. I'm really interested in centering women in the operas that I write. The Knock that I wrote with Alexandra Vrebeloff is about military spouses and goes right into the heart of female experience in the military. So I'm interested in those kinds of stories. And I think story is also what the audience wants. Certainly when you talk to young people, they're the ones who are now buying more tickets than anybody else. They're attending not just opera but everything. They're the new audience. And when you talk to them, what they want is story. They want really good stories. And so I would like to see really good stories in the opera. And I think that's actually what the librettist has to offer.
I was going to say, that's why we need our librettists, so we can have good stories.
It's about poetry, it's about all those other things, but it's that story, the strong narrative, I think is the hook for the new audience, certainly for the younger audience. And, story goes in and out of fashion, but all things come back around. And I think we've come back around to story, and I'm glad about that, and I would like to see more of that.
And I want to ask you both as well. I know that you do a lot of workshopping when you're writing a libretto for opera. I feel like we hear a lot that theater has a lot of workshopping. There's a lot of readings or smaller engagements before something transfers. There's a whole transfer system. Do you feel like that exists the same way in opera? Do you feel like opera could benefit from having a workshopping system, more of a workshopping system? What has been your experience kind of as you have to workshop as you're writing, but then when it comes to getting on stage, do you feel like that translates from theater to opera?
I think that's a complicated question, and it's complicated to go to the theatrical side first. There's this thing that we say in the theater, they're workshopping me to death. And in fact, my play, The Women of Lockerbie, had 20 workshops and 15 different directors before it finally got on stage, all of which were completely unnecessary, right? Because workshopping and readings are a way for a theater company to look like they're doing new work without doing new work. Okay, so it's a trap. And it's a trap that playwrights often get stuck in. Now, obviously, there is a workshopping process. If you're talking about Broadway, for example, or coming into New York, then your workshop, especially if you're in the hands of a good producer, you are getting multiple workshops that are strengthening the work before you get subject to the glare of the critics in New York City. And you want that, and that's really good. But a lot of the workshops are sort of a way to do new work without doing new work. And that's the trap in theater. In opera, we could use a little more workshop. I mean, what I like about opera, what I love about the opera is if you're commissioned, you're going to get produced. That doesn't happen in the theater. You get commissioned and off the play goes, right? And often never gets to the stage. Or it gets workshopped to death and never goes anywhere. Not because the play's not any good, but because the theater's not able to do it. But in the opera, at least you know that your workshop, your libretto workshop, is going to lead to your piano vocal, to your orchestral, to the production. You know you're on that track. I know ALT introduced the workshop model, and it's wonderful. And, you know, it costs money. That's the problem. But I wouldn't be opposed to, you know, maybe being able to do a third draft of a libretto. Sure. Because, I mean, with the libretto, it's you do one draft, you do one rewrite, and it has to be ready for production. And it would be nice to maybe have another step in there, you know. So that's how I see the difference.
Yeah, Stephanie, do you agree? You're nodding a lot.
Yeah, I really thrive in a workshop. I need to hear my work out loud, and I need time built in so that I can go away and write for a day and then come back and hear it again. And also with the piano vocal, like we just got back from doing an orchestration workshop of The Pigeon Keeper at University of Michigan, which was an amazing opportunity. But ultimately, the workshop becomes about just getting it up on its feet for the presentation. And there were many moments along the way where we're like, because everyone's so worried about that, we didn't, even though we had very specific questions about specific moments, we'd love to hear it this way, and we'd love to hear it that way, and in the room, and then decide what we want to do with it. We didn't have time for the work of the workshop, because it's all about just the singers being able to sing it for an audience. And some composers, I mean, opera's challenging because you can't make too many changes. Like in theater, you could give them 20 new pages the next day, but in opera, your changes have to be really small. But every now and then, people are game, and composers write really fast rewrites. And like David Hanlon, we've done huge changes if you have 10 days instead of 6, you can make those changes. But if you only have 6, you can't. And I just say the other thing is that institutionally, everyone is doing new work, and that's great. But I really think, and you know, OPERA America has the New Works Forum, which is great. But I do feel like the institutions that are commissioning and producing new work don't have yet the kind of understanding of process that they need, and that dramaturg person who can really be the advocate for the piece and the collaboration institutionally and with the team. It's not quite built in to the institutions yet, and we could go a little further in that.
Yeah. I've been really fortunate because ALT, we both went through the ALT program.
Shout out to ALT.
American Lyric Theater Composer Librettist Development Program. ALT has sort of come on board several of the operas that I've written and has taken over the workshopping. And that has been such a gift because they really understand the process and sort of guide the development of it when you're with organizations that maybe don't have that kind of understanding. And there's a real role for that, and ALT is sometimes able to fulfill that. And I've been I'm very grateful that I've had that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It's been wonderful.
I want to talk to you both. You're both recent winners of OPERA America's Campbell Art whoa, one more time, Campbell Opera Librettist Prize, the first award in the history of American opera that specifically recognizes the opera librettist. So that's very exciting for you both. Can you talk about what winning such an award means to you and the future of American librettists? Deborah, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, it feels really good to win. I mean, who doesn't like winning prizes, right? I mean, it's wonderful. Shout out to Mark Campbell, who's just the biggest mensch in the world. I know he's listening tonight. Thank you. I know he created this award to put a spotlight on librettists because the librettist has often been overlooked in the opera world, and this prize does that, and we're all very grateful for that, and it certainly gives both of us a leg up in the industry, which is always needed and greatly appreciated, and hopefully the librettists will continue to be recognized more and more. I know when I started writing opera, this was 13 years ago. I went to Carnegie Hall, and only to find that Royce Vavrick, who's a well-known librettist, his first opera was done there with David Little, and he wasn't even in the program. And that was 13 years ago. And I was so outraged by that. That's how much librettists have been overlooked. And certainly this prize really is really helping to stop that. There's also a committee at the Dramatists Guild that has taken on the Credit the Librettist issue. We've created standards which are now being used. We're getting ready to launch another social media campaign about that. But that and Mark Campbell's efforts to really elevate the stature of the librettist is really important and greatly appreciated. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. And Mark has really put his money where his mouth is. I mean, he's such a great advocate for librettists. And even today, I noticed, for instance, speaking of Royce, Breaking the Waves is being done at Detroit Opera. And, the 5 reasons that you should come see Breaking the Waves, and the libretto is nowhere among those reasons. And the video of it's, the composer is key, but so is the librettist. So the video of Missy talking and Royce silent next to her, it still continues. And I do feel like we're co-creators of these stories, these worlds, these experiences, these emotional exchanges. And it's still very built into the infrastructure, especially now that we're so media focused, of metadata for Spotify or Opera Base. I don't think has figured out that lists everyone on the production except for the librettist. And I think it's just a systemic, it's something that just needs to be, it's just protocol and someone changing a system.
Yeah.
And it's the same on YouTube, and it's the same, so I think the more that we can acknowledge the co-creation of these works, just the more amazing writers you're going to attract to the field.
Of course, like we said, we're trying to convert all of our musical theater writers to come and write for opera. Yeah, I think people might not realize how prevalent that still is in the field today. They might think of it as an older issue, but not something that's continuing. So thank you for speaking about that.
We've made inroads, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah,
I will just say that having an award that recognizes what we do is very meaningful, and I hope that more will crop up over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So in closing, I want to ask you, what is a piece of advice that you would offer to playwrights or musical theater writers who are considering writing for opera? What is some advice you'd have for an early career opera librettist or somebody who's coming to opera for the first time? Deborah, I'll start with you.
Well, there's so much advice. Let me see. Well, the first thing I would say is don't write your opera. That was the advice that was given to me, because if you write your opera, it's not going to get done. What you need to do is you need to get a commission, because that's how you can write your opera. But in order to get the commission, you need training. Libretto writing is not playwriting. I mean, it is playwriting, but it's this other thing. And it's also not musical theater writing. Musical theater writing is actually a word-driven form. It is not a music-driven form. And the book writer is is driving the bus in a musical. So, and that's a big switch that has to happen. And the best way to make that switch is, apply to ALT, to that program, apply to AOI at Washington National Opera, apply to the American Opera Works, get that training, start to learn how to do it. You kind of have to go to the opera. A lot of people say, I want to write opera. Like, do you go to the opera? No. Well, maybe you should go to the opera. It's available online. But you need to step through the door of training. It's one of those fields where you need the training, and there's lots of ways to get it. And I would say start there, and also learn the cultural differences. There's a big difference between the culture of a rehearsal hall in an opera versus a musical. Mm-hmm. And I mean, very different ways of collaborating and speaking to each other, mm-hmm. which, I had to learn the hard way because I thought I was in a musical rehearsal. And found out, no, we don't do that in the mm-hmm. opera. We do something else. So, you just need to educate yourself, and the opportunities are there. And so grab those opportunities and jump in.
I think that's great advice. Stephanie, what would you say?
I would say really listen to music and find the composers that really move you, because you will be working on something with them for years, and you want to love the thing that you're making, and you want to be inspired by their work. Also what Deb was saying, this thing about the voice, like I'm still learning so much about the operatic voice and how, words or consonants or a certain vowel sound, it's in certain tessituras, and what's possible and what's not possible, and what, I just worked with Estelle Gomez on this crazy opera with this composer, Yevgeny Charlat, and she can do anything, but not everyone can do anything, and what are the limitations, and then, so I think, and go to the opera, of course, but also go to theater, and also read poetry, and also read novel. Like, it's all consuming, and you can learn about storytelling in all of these forms. If you're a poet, I think you really need to get dramatic training. If you're a playwright, I think you really need to get some kind of experience in distilling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's about learning as much as you can from as many different fields as you can, and applying that to the work that you would like to do. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. I want to thank you both so much for this conversation, Stephanie and Deborah. This has been amazing. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for joining us on the live stream. Have a good night.